Berlin, 1941, The Forced Oath. I never wanted to wear the uniform of Hitler's Reich. Yet on that frozen morning in Berlin, with the grey sky pressing down on the city like a coffin lid, I stood among hundreds of men, my right arm raised, my voice trembling as I swore allegiance to a flag I despised. The words came out dry and hollow, stripped of meaning, but they were all I had left to save my brother's life. For Führer und Vaterland. For the leader and the fatherland. Lies, every syllable of it. But the Gestapo had made their promise clear. Serve, and my brother would walk free. Refuse, and his body would vanish into the smoke of Sachsenhausen. The courtyard of the barracks reeked of diesel and wet iron. Boots struck the ground in perfect rhythm, echoing off the stone walls like hammers against a tomb. The snow melted underfoot, turning into black slush that clung to our uniforms. I remember looking at the officer's eyes, pale, mechanical, like the glass of a camera. He looked through us, not at us. We were not men, only cogs. That was the first day I understood that Germany had traded its soul for machinery. They gave me my papers that afternoon, Kriegsmarine, section of communications. It was meant to be a clean duty, away from the blood and chaos of the front. But even then, I sensed the irony. The war had no clean side. Messages kill just as surely as bullets. You only have to press the right key. I returned to the dormitory, still dizzy from the ceremony. My hands smelled of gun oil and sweat. On the wall above the bunks hung a poster of Hitler, his stare following every movement. I hated that gaze, the way it demanded belief. Around me, young recruits spoke with pride, with fanatic certainty. I envied them. It is easier to kill when you think God himself guides your hand. I had no such illusion. I was not a patriot. I was a man bargaining with hell for one more breath of family. That night, I wrote my brother's name on the inside of my collar, Friedrich, a reminder of why I was still breathing. I imagined him alive somewhere, perhaps forced to break stones or dig trenches, but alive. I imagined the letter that would come soon, released by order of the Reich. That hope kept my hands from shaking when the siren howled for the first time and the searchlights clawed at the sky, hunting for bombers. Berlin was a city at war, but also a city in denial. The cafes still served coffee made from barley, the propaganda screens still promised victory. People wanted to believe that order and faith could outshout the sound of explosions in the east. I could not. Each passing train carried men toward the front and returned carrying silence. When I lay in my bunk that night, the rhythmic clatter of boots in the corridor merged with the pounding of my heart. I realized that I had signed away more than my freedom. I had offered my conscience to a machine I did not understand. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew that this oath would not save my brother, that it would only bind me tighter to his death. The next morning, as the officer read out our assignments, I tried to steady my breathing. Communications division, decoding and transmission. That was my fate. No front lines, no rifle, only the cold click of keys and the silent weight of responsibility. When I looked back at the courtyard, I saw the snow had turned red where the boots had trampled too long. It wasn't blood, just rust from the old iron gate. Still, the image burned itself into my mind. Because I knew, even then, that the next stains would not wash away so easily. I had sworn to a lie. And lies, in war, have a way of demanding payment in flesh. The day I raised my hand to the Reich, I thought I was saving my brother's life. In truth, I was beginning to lose my own. Kiel, 1941, the sound of machines. The wind that swept through the naval base at Kiel carried the smell of salt, oil, and cold iron, the scent of a world built for war. The port was a maze of cranes, gray hulls, and endless echoing footsteps. Every sound seemed measured, calculated, almost mechanical. Even the seagulls, circling above the shipyard, screamed as if mimicking sirens. It was there that I met her for the first time, not a person, but a machine, the Enigma. They brought us into a small communications room lined with cables and metallic cabinets that hummed softly, like sleeping beasts. On the table, the Enigma sat gleaming under the pale light, a wooden box, polished and unassuming, with keys like those of a typewriter and a row of lamps that winked with coded secrets. "The pride of the Reich," said the officer who demonstrated it, his voice filled with reverence. "Our enemies will never read what passes through this beauty." The men around me nodded, eyes shining with faith. I tried to share it, but something in me hesitated. Machines, no matter how brilliant, are still built by men, and men make mistakes. When my fingers touched the keys for the first time, I felt as though I were holding something alive. Each press produced a light on the top panel, a letter transformed, its meaning obscured by shifting logic. The pattern changed daily, sometimes hourly. The officer explained that the combinations numbered in the trillions. Even God himself could not decipher it, he said. I wanted to believe him. I needed to. If Enigma was truly unbreakable, then perhaps this war could still have rules, limits, something predictable amid the chaos. But the room was too quiet. The silence of men who knew they held the power of life and death in their hands. Each message typed was a movement of ships, a convoy's route, a command to fire torpedoes. I began to understand that I was not far from the front. My battlefield was simply made of wires instead of trenches. And every spark that crossed them carried a shadow of destruction. Days became weeks. My world shrank to the clicking rhythm of the machines, the steady heartbeat of Enigma. Operators worked in pairs, recording, encoding, transmitting. The air was thick with the heat of the lamps and the stench of burnt dust. At times, the tapping of dozens of Enigmas across the room synchronized perfectly, creating a strange harmony, like a choir of metal praying to a god of order. I began to memorize the sound each letter made, the way the machine seemed to breathe when the rotors shifted. At night, those clicks echoed in my skull. Sometimes I woke, convinced I could still hear them whispering through the darkness, forming words I could almost understand. One afternoon, a captain from the U-boat command visited our room. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes were hollow, rimmed with sleeplessness. He handed me a slip of paper, coordinates, encrypted orders for a patrol north of Ireland. I coded the message, transmitted it, and filed the record away. A week later, we received news that U-boat never returned. Lost with all hands. Officially, it was mechanical failure. But when I rechecked the log, I noticed something strange. The signal had been clean, flawless. Someone, somewhere, had been waiting. Still, I buried the thought. Superstition, perhaps. Coincidence. The officers always said the British were blind in the Atlantic, sailing helplessly through the dark. And yet, the dark seemed to be watching us. In the evenings, I walked along the docks, watching submarines glide like silent sharks into the sea. Their steel hulls reflected the cold light of the moon, vanishing beneath the waves. The men waved from the decks, their laughter fading into the wind. I often wondered if any of them would ever return, or if their final words would pass through my hands, transformed into ciphers no one would ever read again. The Enigma was our guardian, they told us. The shield of Germany. But as I listened to its endless clicking, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't protecting us at all. It was recording us. Watching. Waiting. And somewhere, I feared, it was already whispering our secrets to someone else. Kiel, late 1941, Voices in Code. Weeks blurred into months, and my life became a rhythm of keys, rotors, and silence. The Enigma no longer amazed me, it haunted me. I could type with my eyes half closed now, my fingers moving automatically, like a pianist chained to a song he no longer wished to play. Every day, messages poured in from U-boat commanders scattered across the Atlantic, cold, terse words transformed into streams of symbols. I transmitted death wrapped in mathematics. We were not supposed to understand the messages we handled. That was the rule. Each operator was a single cog in a vast, unseen engine. I typed, encoded, relayed, never questioned. Yet sometimes, fragments broke through. A phrase in plain German mistakenly left unencrypted. A name of a ship I had heard before. A call for medical supplies that would never arrive. It was enough to remind me that behind every string of numbers and letters lay human voices, frightened, tired, desperate. The communications chamber was always dim, the air heavy with the stench of grease and burnt electricity. Machines hummed, and somewhere above us, the faint sound of ship horns echoed through the fog. At times I wondered if the whole world outside still existed, or if we were living inside the pulse of the Enigma itself, prisoners of its rhythm. One evening, an urgent transmission arrived from the Atlantic. The operator beside me, a boy barely 18, handed me the cipher sheet with trembling hands. Immediate contact lost. Coordinates confirmed. Awaiting instruction. I encoded it and sent it upward through the chain of command. The next day, we received a follow-up. The U-boat had been destroyed, depth-charged before it could dive. All 42 men lost. I stared at the paper until the letters blurred. Oh. The enemy should not have known those coordinates. They had been generated hours earlier with a fresh key. The British are lucky, one officer said, shrugging. The sea sometimes chooses its victims. But I knew better. Luck did not repeat itself so precisely. The losses multiplied. Each week, another crew disappeared into the Atlantic's cold grave. Our commanders blamed technical failures, inexperienced captains, or chance. But whispers began to spread through the operators' quarters, quiet, fearful murmurs after lights out. Someone's leaking information. The codes are compromised. There's a traitor among us. The paranoia crept into every conversation, every glance. Men began to distrust even the air around them. I tried to bury my doubts, to remind myself that I was only a technician, a servant of logic. Yet the logic no longer made sense. The messages we sent, encrypted beyond comprehension, still led to disaster. It was as if someone were reading over my shoulder every time I touched the keys. At night, when the others slept, I sometimes replayed old transmissions on the receiver, listening to the static, the mechanical heartbeat of Morse code. Amid the noise, I thought I could hear echoes of voices, German words distorted, lost beneath waves of interference. Orders that never reached their destinations. Pleas for rescue that no one would ever answer. Each pulse of sound was a ghost, calling through time. I began keeping a small notebook hidden in my locker, recording every strange coincidence, every disappearance. I told myself it was for accuracy, for discipline, but deep down, I think I was trying to preserve a fragment of truth in a war built entirely on lies. Once, in the early hours before dawn, the Enigma's lamp bulbs flickered as I typed. For a split second, I imagined it hesitating, as if the machine itself knew what it was concealing. The light blinked out, then returned. My reflection in its polished metal looked like a stranger's face. I thought of my brother that night, wherever he was, perhaps already gone. I wondered if his name had once passed through an Enigma too, buried inside some coded list of the condemned. Every message I sent felt heavier. Each key I pressed sounded less like communication, and more like confession. I didn't know it yet, but the voices I heard in that static weren't ghosts. They were warnings. And soon, they would start to speak more clearly. Loria, early 1942, the silence of Loria. When they transferred me to Loria, I thought I was escaping the noise of Kiel, the endless hum of machines, the clatter of messages, the suspicion that clung to every whisper. But Loria was worse. The silence there was alive. It waited. The base lay buried beneath concrete and salt air, a fortress carved into the coast of occupied France. From the surface, it looked like the world's largest tomb, thick gray walls, armored doors, no windows. The Atlantic wind howled across the harbor, mixing with the stench of oil and rust. Everything here smelled of metal and exhaustion. Our communications room sat deep underground, protected from bombardment. The first time I entered, I felt the weight of the sea above me, pressing through layers of steel and stone. The operators worked under red lamps to protect our eyes from sudden blackouts. The air was damp and tasted of mold. Every word we transmitted vibrated through that heavy air, as though the ocean itself were listening. Each night, I watched the U-boats depart, sleek, dark shapes slipping silently into the tide. The crews always waved, shouting promises of victory. Some were barely more than boys, grinning through the fog as if going on an adventure. We'd hear their coded transmissions days later. U-557 reporting position. Enemies sighted. Dive, dive, dive. Then silence. Weeks would pass, and they would not return. When the doors of the pen opened again, sometimes only fragments came back, wreckage fished from the water, a floating logbook, a nameplate scarred by fire. The survivors walked differently, their faces pale and hollow. They never spoke about what they had seen below the waves. You could tell a man who'd survived depth charges by the way his hands trembled, even at rest. Our job was to record, encrypt, and send the last words of those men. Coordinates, sightings, mechanical failures, all filtered through the Enigma's indifferent logic. The machine gave every message the same weight, whether it meant life or death. It was impossible not to feel the irony. We were surrounded by so much communication, and yet the deeper we sank into our own systems, the less human any of it felt. Sometimes, late at night, I would stand on the catwalk above the pens. Below me, the black water rippled with reflections of floodlights. The sound of the diesel engines throbbed through my chest like a second heartbeat. The Atlantic stretched out into darkness, vast and merciless. It seemed to devour everything we sent into it: men, messages, hope. One evening, I received an encoded report from a U-boat operating near Gibraltar. The transmission was faint, broken by static, but I recognized the captain's signature code. I decrypted the message, logged it, and passed it along. 2 days later, command reported the submarine lost. Another name crossed off the list. Afterward, I began to notice a pattern. Every few weeks, the same thing, a transmission perfectly encoded, yet the enemy somehow already waiting. It was too precise to be coincidence. I mentioned it once to a superior officer, carefully, without accusation. He stared at me for a long moment, then said coldly, "Machines do not betray us. Men do." That was the end of the conversation. So I kept my thoughts to myself. I worked in silence, buried in the heartbeat of the Enigma, surrounded by the ghosts of men who would never speak again. The days grew colder. The nights longer. The sea outside the pens turned black as oil. I remember one morning stepping outside after a night shift, the sky heavy with mist. The U-boats were gone, the bay eerily still. In that moment, I realized what haunted Loria wasn't just death, it was the waiting. The endless, suffocating waiting for news that never came. And in that silence, I began to feel something new, not fear, but certainty. Someone, somewhere, was listening to us. Loria, mid-1942, the first doubt. It began with one message. Routine, precise, unremarkable, a patrol order for U-312, directing it to a sector west of Ireland. I encoded it, verified the rotors, checked the plugs twice. The transmission left the room clean and flawless, the way all good messages did. 2 days later, we received a report from command. U-312 sunk with all hands. No survivors. The words didn't make sense. The coordinates were correct, the code intact, the route secret. Only 3 men in Loria had known of it, myself included. Yet somehow, the British had been waiting. At first, I tried to dismiss it. The ocean is merciless. Perhaps it was a random encounter, a misfortune of the sea. But then came U-204. Then U-583. Each time, the same pattern, a message sent, a delay, and then silence. Whispers crept through the corridors. Bad luck, some said. Others muttered darker things. One technician swore he'd heard an intercepted Allied broadcast mentioning our patrol zones, information that should have been impossible to obtain. He was transferred the next morning. None of us ever saw him again. The air inside the bunker grew heavier. The Enigma keys, once a symbol of certainty, now felt like instruments of doom. Every time I pressed one, I wondered if I was sealing another crew's fate. The machine's lights flickered with cruel indifference, illuminating my doubts in flashes of pale yellow. During night shifts, I began reviewing the logs, not officially, just to satisfy the voice in my head whispering that something was wrong. The coincidences were too exact, the timings too sharp. It was as though the British already knew our thoughts before we could send them. Still, no one dared to say it aloud. The Enigma might be compromised. Such words were treason. And treason was answered with a single bullet. One evening, while filing a transmission record, I caught my reflection in the polished casing of the machine. My eyes looked hollow, my uniform stiff with salt and sweat. I realized then that the war was no longer out at sea. It was here, inside these walls, inside my head. I began to dread each new message. Each time I turned the rotors, it felt as if I were winding a clock counting down to another death. They called it chance. I called it something else. Someone was reading us. Loria, late 1942, The Betrayed Code. By autumn, the sea had turned cruel. The Atlantic was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard, filling faster than our messages could record it. Every morning, New lists arrived, U-boats lost, crews missing, positions confirmed by the enemy before they ever reached us. Yet command insisted that Enigma was flawless. Our codes are pure mathematics, the officers repeated. The British are simply lucky. But luck doesn't strike the same coordinates twice. I had begun keeping count in my notebook, 37 submarines gone in 3 months. All had used the new Enigma settings, supposedly unbreakable, changed daily by orders from Berlin. We recalibrated, we re-encrypted, we prayed to reason itself. But still, the enemy was always there, waiting, as if listening to our thoughts. I remember one particular night vividly. A storm raged above the base, waves crashing against the submarine pens, lightning slicing through the fog. Inside, the Enigma machines clattered endlessly. I sat alone in the red-lit communications room, typing coordinates for a convoy interception west of Iceland. Each letter blinked back at me, perfect, precise, meaningless. When I transmitted the message, I felt a chill crawl through my spine, as though something invisible had just left with it. 3 days later, the U-boat we'd directed there was destroyed. No survivors. The British had been waiting with destroyers positioned exactly on our plotted course. I didn't need proof anymore. The pattern was clear. Someone, or something, was reading us. Panic spread through the ranks like a sickness. The officers called it technical coincidence. The men called it ghosts in the code. By the time the next set of orders arrived from Berlin, the word doubt had become a secret everyone carried but no one dared to speak. We were ordered to change our cipher keys every midnight. The process became ritual, switching rotors, resetting plugs, praying that tomorrow's configuration would finally bring silence from the enemy. It didn't. The more we changed, the faster the losses came. As if the enemy could hear us change the keys. As if the Enigma itself had begun whispering. One evening, an engineer from Kiel arrived, a specialist in communication security. He was pale, nervous, his eyes darting constantly toward the corners of the room. He spoke softly to the commanding officer, but his words carried across the silence. "The British are intercepting us before we transmit." The officer's hand slammed on the table. "Impossible! Unless—" He stopped mid-sentence, and the two men exchanged a glance that made my blood freeze. That same night, the order came down. All operators are to maintain absolute secrecy. Any discussion of code failure will be considered treason. The next morning, 3 men were missing. Their bunks stripped clean. No explanation. Only silence. I began to notice new faces around the base, SS officers in black coats, standing too close to the communications wing, listening to our every word. Their boots echoed in the corridors like warning shots. One of them watched me for too long, his eyes narrowing when I hesitated at the Enigma. From that moment, I spoke less, breathed less, thought less. It was safer that way. But my mind never stopped turning. I studied the machine every night after duty, tracing its logic, its intricate dance of rotors. It was perfect, too perfect. Human minds had built it, but human pride had blinded them. Every pattern, no matter how complex, hides repetition. And repetition, given time, becomes a weakness. The British must have found it. Somewhere, in the endless numbers and wheels, they had seen the pattern we couldn't, or refused to. Once, during a rare moment of courage, I whispered to a fellow operator, "What if they can read us?" He stared at me as though I had confessed a crime. "They'd kill us for saying that," he muttered. Then, after a pause, he added, "Maybe they already are." The storm passed outside, but inside the bunker, the air felt heavier than ever. The Enigma sat silent, waiting for the next message. I stared at it, its keys gleaming in the dim light, and realized something terrifying. We had built a machine we no longer controlled. And somewhere across the sea, someone else was listening, someone who already knew what we were going to say before we said it. Lorya, December 1942, the name Ultra. It was a night soaked in cold rain when I first heard the word that would never leave my mind. Ultra. The storm outside howled like a wounded animal, the wind scraping against the steel doors of the submarine pen. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and electricity. We were 6 men huddled in the dim light, our hands stiff from endless hours of transmission. Cigarette smoke coiled through the red glow of the lamps. The Enigma machines clicked steadily, their rhythm almost hypnotic. Every message was another pulse of the Reich's iron heart. That night, one of the operators, Kruger, a man whose courage often came from the bottom of a bottle, stumbled in late, soaked to the bone and smelling of schnapps. He dropped heavily into his chair, muttering about ghosts in the signal. The others laughed, until his words sharpened. "You know what they call it," he slurred. "The British, they have a name for it. Ultra. They can read us. Every word." The room went still. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain drumming on the roof above and the faint crackle of the radio static. I stared at him, waiting for a laugh, for the punchline. But his eyes weren't mocking, they were terrified. "I heard it from a man in Brest," he continued, voice trembling now. "A Luftwaffe signal officer. He said the English have broken Enigma. They're reading everything. Everything." Someone barked, "Shut your mouth before someone hears you." The youngest of us crossed himself. Kruger just leaned back, exhaling smoke. "You can burn your codes, change your rotors, it won't matter," he said. "They already know." The chief operator reported him in the morning. By noon, Kruger was gone. His bunk stripped bare, his name erased from the duty roster. No one said a word. But that night, when I sat before my Enigma, I couldn't stop hearing that word echoing in my mind, Ultra. It sounded like something beyond human. Something watching from above. I began noticing strange things after that. Small, almost imperceptible details. Our encoded messages arriving back from command hours earlier than usual. Orders adjusted before we'd even reported results. It was as if someone had already anticipated our next move. One transmission, I remember, came back with a correction before the original had been fully acknowledged. It felt impossible, yet it happened again and again. I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the bunker seemed amplified, the whine of the generators, the clicking of the relays, the endless tapping of the keys. In the dark, I thought I could hear the Enigma breathing. The rhythm of its rotors reminded me of a heartbeat, steady, mechanical, inhuman. The next week, Allied aircraft appeared over the bay at dawn, bombing a convoy that had departed only hours earlier. They struck with surgical precision, every ship, every path, as if guided by invisible eyes. We had changed the cipher that morning. No leak, no human hand could have betrayed it. And yet they came, right on time. That night, when the all-clear sirens wailed and the fires still burned along the shore, I sat by the window of the communications room and watched the smoke rise over the Atlantic. The world outside flickered orange and black, destruction choreographed by an unseen conductor. I pressed my palms against the cold glass and whispered the name again. Ultra. It felt less like a word and more like a verdict. In the days that followed, no one spoke openly about it, but the fear was everywhere. The younger operators avoided eye contact. The older ones clung to the illusion of control, their faith in the machine unshaken, or perhaps too fragile to break. Every time a transmission arrived from Berlin, we wondered who had truly written it, our own command, or the silent mind across the channel that already knew what we would say. I tried to dismiss it as drunken nonsense, as rumor. But the pattern didn't lie. The British weren't just intercepting us. They were inside our words, bending them, guiding them, turning our own secrecy into their weapon. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote only one line beneath the long list of lost boats and broken messages. The British call it Ultra. We call it fate. And for the first time since the war began, I realized that we were no longer fighting the Allies. We were fighting something far more dangerous, the truth. Loria, early 1943, the visit from the SS officer. The message arrived at dawn. A special investigator will inspect your station. Maintain discipline. We knew what that meant. Someone had whispered too loudly. When the black car pulled up to the bunker gates, the air seemed to freeze. From it stepped an officer of the SS, tall, immaculate, the silver skull on his cap glinting beneath the winter sun. His name was Obersturmführer Weiss. His eyes were colorless, like the glass of a periscope staring into the depths. He walked through our communications room in silence, hands clasped behind his back, the click of his boots echoing off the concrete. Every operator stiffened when he passed. I kept my gaze fixed on the Enigma, fingers trembling over the keys. Weiss paused behind me for a moment, watching. I could feel his breath on my neck. Then he moved on. He spent the day examining logs, transmission records, code sheets. He asked quiet questions, never raising his voice. How often are the key settings changed? Who records the cipher rotors? Who verified the authenticity of the incoming orders? His tone was calm, but each word carried weight. It wasn't curiosity, it was a hunt. By late afternoon, he ordered 3 operators to follow him outside for questioning. We all knew what that meant. The door closed. Minutes later, sharp cracks echoed from behind the storage shed. Then, silence. No one spoke. The machines continued their endless clicking, indifferent to the lives just erased. I kept typing, each keystroke heavier than the last. That night, Weiss returned to the communications hall. His gloves were spotless. "You will redouble your vigilance," he said softly. "The Führer trusts the purity of your code. Any man who doubts Enigma doubts Germany itself." He stared at me longer than necessary. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he smiled, a small, surgical smile, and left. After he was gone, we sat in the red glow of the lamps, no one daring to speak. The operator next to me whispered, "They weren't traitors." I didn't answer. Because in the Reich, guilt was never about proof. It was about fear. For the next week, no one drank, no one joked, no one breathed without permission. The Enigma keys clicked like gunfire in the night. Every time I touched them, I remembered the sound of those shots behind the shed. Weiss's visit didn't restore order. It buried it. The real message he left us was unspoken. The enemy may be listening, but so are we. From that day on, I learned to keep my thoughts encrypted too. And as I worked, I began to realize something even more terrifying. The SS didn't come because the British had broken our code. They came because someone in Berlin suspected it might be true. And in Nazi Germany, suspicion was a death sentence waiting to be written, one letter at a time. Loria, spring 1943, echoes on the radio. After Weiss's visit, silence became our language. We worked without words, communicating only through glances and gestures. The paranoia was complete, not just fear of the British, but of our own shadows. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that I first intercepted them, the voices. The Allied frequencies were usually cluttered with noise, static, and false signals. But that night, something different came through the receiver, crisp, deliberate transmissions in English, broken by bursts of code. I recognized fragments, positions, times, patterns that mirrored our own logs. My hands went cold. I checked the cipher sheet twice, then again. Impossible. These were German coordinates, encrypted phrases that only our Enigmas could generate. Yet there they were, repeated across the airwaves in an enemy voice. I began recording them secretly onto magnetic reels, hiding them in a metal case beneath the floorboards. If the SS found out, I would be accused of espionage. But I couldn't stop. The signals fascinated and terrified me. It was as if someone on the other side of the channel was reading our thoughts out loud. Days later, during a storm, I tuned in again and heard a clear phrase through the static, "Convoy intercepted. Submarine neutralized." Then silence. My stomach turned. The time and location matched a message I had transmitted 2 nights earlier. We weren't merely being read. We were being answered. Each transmission I intercepted sounded eerily familiar. Words, codes, entire patterns I'd seen before, mirrored and returned. It was like listening to an echo from across the sea, except the echo always came first. I started to believe the British weren't just decoding us. They were anticipating us, predicting our decisions before we made them. Every operation became a suicide mission preordained by mathematics. Once, during a rare moment of courage, I played one of the recordings for another operator. His face went pale. "Destroy it," he whispered. "If the SS finds this, we're dead." But I didn't destroy it. I hid it deeper. A part of me needed proof that my sanity hadn't broken with the war. Soon after, a new wave of air raids struck Loria. The bombs fell closer each night, shaking the walls, filling the corridors with dust. Between explosions, I could still hear the whispers of those English transmissions. Cold, precise, merciless. Sometimes, in the dark, I imagined the men sending them, faces I would never see, hands steady over their own machines, turning our secrets into their weapon. Somewhere across the sea, a mind was listening, dissecting every keystroke I made. And in the faint hum of the radio, static, I thought I heard a voice that wasn't quite human, calm, patient, mathematical. The voice of Alan Turing. Loria, summer 1943, the portrait of my brother. The letter came folded in brown military paper, stamped with the eagle of the Reich. I knew before opening it. My hands refused to tear the seal. My brother Friedrich, the reason I had sworn to serve, was dead. The words were efficient, emotionless, deceased in a labor facility near Linz. Cause, illness. Illness, that bureaucratic lie. Everyone knew what illness meant in those camps. I stared at the page until the ink bled into my vision. The oath I had made, the uniform I wore, the blood I scrubbed from my hands, all of it had been for nothing. That night, I found the small photograph I had carried since Berlin, the two of us as children, standing by the river Spree, sunlight in our faces. I tore it in half and kept only his eyes. I placed it beneath the Enigma machine, as if the dead could still watch the living betray them. After that, something in me broke. I no longer worked for the Reich. I worked out of habit, the mechanical reflex of survival. Every coded message, every transmission felt like a nail sealing my brother's coffin. When the officers spoke of victory, their words turned hollow in my ears. The U-boats kept vanishing, and the officers kept lying. Coincidence, they said. Weather, they said. Sabotage. I knew better. The British had broken us. The Reich was bleeding from within, and the men in charge refused to see it. At night, when the generators fell silent, I thought I could hear my brother's voice in the hum of the cables. Not words, just a sound like breathing. Maybe it was only the wind through the ducts. Maybe guilt has its own frequency. The next morning, when I sat again before the machine, I looked at the torn photograph beneath the keys. His eyes stared up at me from the shadows. For the first time, I pressed the keys slowly, deliberately, knowing the message I sent might kill men who still believed in a country that had killed him. And I realized, loyalty is the cruelest code of all. Loria, late 1943, the shadow of Bletchley. The first time I heard the name Turing was from a Luftwaffe technician who arrived to recalibrate our transmitters. He spoke casually, almost in awe. The British have a man, a mathematician. Alan Turing. They say he builds machines that think faster than men. The name struck me like a bullet. Machines that think. For years, I had believed Enigma was alive, that it breathed and judged us. But now I understood the truth. It was not our machine that lived. It was theirs. The technician told me that British intercept stations, Bletchley Park, he called it, worked around the clock, decoding our messages as we sent them. They call it ultra, he added, glancing around as if afraid the walls could hear. They know everything before it happens. That night, I couldn't sleep. The storm winds from the Atlantic rattled the bunker doors, and I lay awake, imagining this Turing, a quiet man, glasses glinting in the glow of a lamp, surrounded by machines spinning faster than thought. Somewhere, far from the roar of the sea, he was reading me. Reading us. For months, I had believed we were haunted. Now I had a name for the ghost. In the following days, I began noticing patterns, faint, deliberate echoes in the signals we intercepted. English transmissions referencing events they could not have known yet. Convoy rerouted. U-boat sighted. Always hours before it happened. One evening, as I copied a message from command, I whispered the name under my breath. Turing. The sound of it seemed to vibrate through the room. The others looked up. I said it was nothing, just static. But it wasn't. It was prophecy. Every key I touched after that felt like an offering to him, to the invisible mind dismantling my world one calculation at a time. And in a strange, shameful way, I almost admired him. Loria, November 1943, the order to burn everything. The order came sealed and urgent. All cipher logs, transmissions, and code sheets prior to 1943 are to be destroyed immediately. We knew why. The Reich was afraid. For 2 days straight, we burned everything. Crates of messages, thousands of typed pages, rolls of perforated tape feeding into the flames. The smell of burning paper mixed with oil and smoke until it clung to our skin. The bunker glowed orange, a furnace of vanished truths. Officers shouted for speed. No trace left. The Führer commands it. But I hesitated. Among the piles, I found one message printed on old Enigma paper, dated 1941. It contained a code pattern I didn't recognize, and next to it, a single English phrase written by hand, "We are listening." My pulse froze. It was impossible. That paper had been in our archives for 2 years, meaning the British had been reading us since the beginning. I hid it under my tunic, feeling its heat through the fabric as the fires raged. That night, when the last of the ashes cooled, I sat alone in the darkened room, holding the scorched paper. The ink had bled, but the words were still legible. "We are listening." It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. The next morning, I watched the officers salute the smoke as if it were some sacred ritual of purification. They thought they were destroying evidence of weakness. But I knew what we had truly burned that day. Not paper, not codes, not orders. We had burned our illusion of secrecy. And the ashes whispered the truth. The war was already lost. North Atlantic, winter 1943, the lost U-boat. They sent me to sea at last, not as a soldier, but as a technician aboard U-956, tasked with ensuring secure transmissions. I welcomed the transfer. Anything was better than the suffocating paranoia of Lorya. But the ocean had its own kind of silence, heavier, endless. The first days were routine. The crew joked, smoked, and pretended not to think about the odds. The commander, Captain Lieutenant Weber, was young but hard as steel. He trusted the Enigma as if it were scripture. Every morning, I set the machine, typed the coordinates, and transmitted our position. On the fourth day, the sonar picked up faint pings, distant, deliberate. "Destroyers," whispered the navigator. The tension grew hour by hour. When the first depth charge exploded, the lights flickered, and I tasted metal in my mouth. The explosions came again, closer. The sea became a wall of noise. We dove deeper. Sweat ran down the walls, condensation dripping like rain. Every man waited for the next blast, every breath an act of faith. The commander turned to me. "They knew where we were," he said flatly. I couldn't answer. I didn't need to. Hours passed before silence returned. When we surfaced, the ocean was empty. No ships, no life, only the echo of our own engines. But the truth was clear. The British hadn't found us by chance. They had followed our words through the water. That night, as I stared at the machine in the corner, its keys glinting faintly in the lamplight, I felt a terrible certainty. We weren't the hunters anymore. We were the prey. Lorya, early 1944, the final decoding. Back at Lorya, I could barely sleep. The mission had left me hollow, and the message I carried burned in my mind. Among my hidden papers was that same note. "We are listening." I needed to know. One night, when the others slept, I inserted it into the Enigma, adjusting the rotors to the settings of that week in 1941. The machine hummed softly, its bulbs flickering like dying stars. Then the lights formed a phrase, not in code, but in English. "We can hear you." I froze. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. A message within the message, written by those who had already broken us. My hands shook as I stared at the machine. The room felt colder, as if someone stood just behind me, reading over my shoulder. I realized then that the British hadn't just decrypted our secrets. They were mocking us, speaking directly through our own weapon. When I shut off the machine, the silence rang like a scream. I couldn't unsee the words. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "The war is no longer fought with steel or blood. It is fought with thought." And in that battle, we were already dead. Lorya, June 1944, the firestorm. The bombs came without warning. The sirens screamed only seconds before the first explosion. The ground trembled, lights burst, and the world turned orange. Lorya burned. The Allied planes came in waves, relentless, precise, as if guided by invisible coordinates. The Enigma room collapsed around me. Fire devoured the cables, and the walls split like paper. I ran through smoke and dust, clutching the scorched tape, the proof I had hidden for months. Outside, The submarine pens were infernos, men running, shouting, dissolving into flame. The smell of burning oil and flesh merged into one unbearable stench. I stumbled toward the docks, half blind, the sky alive with fire. Above the roar, I could still hear it, the mechanical rhythm, the echo of keys I would never touch again. In my pocket, the message still read, "We can hear you." The machine was gone, the Reich collapsing, the sea turning red, but the voice of the code remained. And I understood, in that apocalyptic light, that the British hadn't just destroyed our secrets. They had rewritten the language of war itself. Loria, May 1945, the surrender. By the spring of 1945, Loria was nothing but rubble and ash. The sea smelled of rust and defeat. The war that had consumed the world was ending, but inside the ruined base, time had already stopped. Our Enigma machines lay shattered, their once precise rotors scattered like bones. The silence felt heavier than any bombing. When the Americans arrived, I didn't resist. I was too tired to fear. They lined us up in the courtyard where I had once taken my oath. The same echo of boots, the same cold wind, only the flag above us had changed. They questioned me for days. "What do you know of Bletchley Park? Of Ultra? Of Turing?" I told them the truth, that I was only a technician, a ghost among machines. But when I said Turing's name, they exchanged glances and smiled. One of them leaned forward and whispered, "The mathematics one, German." The words stung more than any accusation. I was taken to a camp for interrogation. The officers wanted details of the Enigma's inner workings, as if the machine still mattered. I told them what they wanted to hear, though each word felt like a confession, not of guilt, but of futility. The Reich had fallen, but the sound of Enigma's keys still haunted my sleep. The rhythm, the pulse, the illusion of control. I had lived my war behind a keyboard, and yet the blood was still on my hands. They said I was lucky to be alive. But I didn't feel alive. I felt decoded. Landsberg Prison, 1949, the forgotten file. Years passed behind walls of gray stone. The war receded into rumor and memory, but its ghosts never left me. The days blurred, marked only by the sound of footsteps and the turning of keys, echoes of a different kind of machine. Then one morning, a guard brought me a parcel. No sender. Inside was a small envelope containing a single sheet of paper, a carbon copy of the message I had hidden in 1943. The same phrase, still legible despite the years, "We can hear you." Beneath it, in careful handwriting, another line had been added, "Even machines cannot hide guilt." No signature. No explanation. My hands trembled as I read it again and again. How had it found me? Who had sent it? Was it mockery? Or mercy? I thought of Turing, the invisible man who had read our thoughts from across the sea. Could this be his final word to me? For days, I couldn't sleep. I heard the ticking of phantom rotors in my dreams, the endless decoding of my own life. I wanted to destroy the paper, to burn it like the rest. But I couldn't. It was proof that someone, somewhere, still remembered. That guilt, like code, is never truly erased. Berlin, 1960, the last code. I write these lines as an old man, long after the guns have fallen silent. The world has rebuilt itself with new machines, faster, colder, more intelligent. I see Enigma's shadow in them all. People say the war was lost on the battlefield. They are wrong. It was lost in the silence between transmissions, in the arrogance that believed a machine could guard a nation's soul. Enigma did not fail us. We failed it, by believing that secrecy could replace conscience. I often wonder about Alan Turing, the man who saw through our lies without ever firing a shot. He read our plans, our fears, our hearts. In breaking our code, he broke the illusion that evil could hide behind order. Now, as I press these final words onto paper, I realize what he truly uncovered. Not messages, not coordinates, but men. When Turing read our secrets, he didn't just decipher our plans. He deciphered us.